Okay, welcome to LAB with a very special guest here this week. We're coming from the lovely Haymarket Hotel because it's Legal Geek Week, which is my favourite week of the entire year, mainly because I get to meet wonderful people like Mark, who doesn't come to the country very often because he's from across the pond. I will let the lovely Mark Cohen introduce himself, as he will definitely do it better than I will.
Well, thank you, Chrissie, and it's great to be here. So I'm Mark Cohen. It's a pleasure to be on your vlog. You're my favorite vlogger, may I say. And I have been in the legal industry for a very long time. For many years, I was a bet the company trial lawyer. I was a managing partner of a law firm. I was an outside general counsel to 3 insurance companies. I ran an international business that I was appointed receiver of. That means simply that a judge basically decides that someone has to take over the company because it's not doing something right, whether it's not paying your taxes or some other reason. And I have been very involved through the last 15 years in pursuing a number of things. Innovation and modernization of legal education, legal re-regulation, that is trying to liberalize and re-regulate the legal industry in such a way that the rules are skewed more in favor of what's good for clients, but not necessarily what's so good for lawyers, and also in terms of the delivery of legal services. That is, how can legal services be delivered more accessibly, more affordably, and tap into technology that enables new models so that people can acquire much needed access to legal representation in ways that the traditional older models don't do terribly well. And I write for Forbes, I speak around the world, and most of all, I'm a very proud dad of 2 very bright young women.
So we're very lucky to have Mark because I absolutely love Mark's column in Forbes, and actually got in touch with him after an article that I think you wrote about legal education, which really resonated with me because I think some of your ideas about how we should be training lawyers of the future, what lawyers of the future look like, what their skill set looks like. I really like some of the suggestions that you have. So that, although I'd love to talk to you about all of those things today, including technology, innovation, service delivery, what I really want to talk to you today is your thoughts on legal education and how you think we should be building the lawyer of the future. So in one of your recent articles, you talked about the skill set that you think the lawyer of the future should have or needs to have in order to compete and be successful in the current climate. Do you just want to talk us through some of those skills that you think are relevant?
Sure, I'd be happy to, Chrissie. So before answering your question directly, let me just take a step back and say that why are we talking about changes in legal education and what has changed? And what has changed is that law used to be exclusively about lawyers. Now it's about lawyers, but it's also about technologists. It's also about business people who are able to instill project and process management to the process of delivering legal services. It's not just about lawyers and law anymore. And law schools, whether it's here in the UK, across the pond in the United States, throughout Europe, in most Asian countries, law school is continuing, for the most part, to train young lawyers in the same way it did when I was a baby lawyer many years ago. And I think, so that's the kind of a context for your question.
Okay.
That law is no longer just about knowing legal doctrine and legal fundamentals. In my day, that was enough to guarantee someone a kind of a predictable, secure, socially acceptable career. Today, just knowing the law is not going to cut it. So what are those other skill sets? I want to say that one need not necessarily be an expert in any or all of these fields, but I think it's important to at least have a rudimentary understanding of what I'm about to enumerate.
Yep.
So one would be, you have to understand the industry. That is to say, if you're going to go into law, just as you're going to go into any other industry, you should have an awareness of who the players are, what's going on in the industry, and most importantly, how is the industry changing as a result of the technological explosion that has occurred in the last 10 or so years.
Yeah.
You're also going to want to understand a little bit about data. I was a trial lawyer, and I found it remarkable that when people would talk about, even trial lawyers would talk about a particular case, they would always refer to some anatomical part to predict what was going to happen. So they would say, my nose tells me this, or my gut tells me that. But we're now living in an age of data, where data is being used for many different purposes. And so lawyers today have to have an understanding of data, how it's used, when it's material, and for what purposes it should be used. I think that lawyers should also have an understanding of what I'm calling delivery models. And that's just a fancy term for what is the structure by which the services or products that are being delivered are rendered. So for example, let's take taxi cabs. For many, many years, the London cab was, sort of the only ride-hailing form. Now you've got Uber and you've got other types of things. So what's the difference? Well, it's not just a question of the color and size of the vehicle, but it's also about the technology. It's also about the price. It's also about the accessibility. These same kind of changes that are occurring with taxi cabs and so many other industries are now taking place in law. And if you're going to be a lawyer, you should at least have a fundamental or rudimentary understanding, I should say, of some of these changes. And then finally, I would say that lawyers would do well to understand the basics of project management. And what is project management? Well, just think of yourself when you get up in the morning. You may not be aware of it, but you're actually going through a process of project management where you're mapping out a sequence for all the things you need to do to go from getting out of bed in the morning to getting yourself to work. Now, it may be different for everybody in this audience, but for most people, there would be some common denominators. You'd say, well, maybe I'm going to, give my wife or husband or partner, or the pet some coffee or water. I'm going to brush my teeth. I'm going to shower. I'm going to shave. When you think through what the sequence is, that is actually a form of project management. Now, applied to, legal careers, lawyers are just very used to thinking, well, I'm going to bill a certain number of hours. And it doesn't really matter what the sequence is or how I go about doing it. Well, today it does matter. It matters very, very much. So I would think of project management as organizational skills. I think that's critically important. So these are just some of the additional or augmented skills besides knowing the law, Chrissie, that I think all young lawyers or future lawyers should be aware of.
Okay, I totally agree with all of that. So we talked about data and also legal services delivery. To a certain extent, project management and organization is something which we can teach ourselves to a certain extent. When you manage deadlines and various different things that you're doing during the course of university, you can learn to organize yourself. But in terms of learning about data and learning about client service and all of those things, if you're a student, how do you go about learning those skills? Is it something that you can teach yourself? Should universities be teaching it? Where can you learn to develop these skills that the future lawyer needs?
Great question. So in my day, you really had to go to school and take a certain course to be able to really, I think, zero in on one of these kinds of subjects. You could go to a library and you could read up about it, but very often, you couldn't learn in real time. And very often you go to the library, for example, and of course you finally find the book that you want and it's been checked out.
Yeah.
Whereas today, with the internet, of course, you have at your fingertips access to the greatest library that's ever been created since human beings have inhabited the planet. You also have self-help tools, which are terrific ways. And I think what we're doing, Chrissie, is we're moving increasingly, not only in law, but in many other fields of endeavor, from an age like my age, where it was very diploma-driven. And you kind of got your diploma and that was pretty much it. Yes, maybe you did a little bit of a refresher course every now and again, but things didn't change all that much or all that quickly. Today, things are moving so quickly that I think you have to have a mentality of lifetime learning. What you know now is great and you can always augment it, but it may not be what you need to know a year or 2 years from now.
Yeah.
So you have to constantly be updating yourself, and there are many different ways that you could do it. Part of it would be online self-help courses. Part of it, of course, could just be reading on your own. Part of it could be utilizing social media to find out, for example, who are the experts in this field or that field, what have they written? And then, as you did, you reached out to me directly. In my age, you would have had to have, written a letter. It would be a couple of weeks. It get lost in the pile. I finally write back, and of course, we wouldn't have the same kind of means of communication that you do today. So I think the challenge is that you have to be more intellectually agile and constantly learning. But the opportunity is that the tools are there to allow that to happen for those who are kind of using good career project management to focus on what they need to know.
Okay. So you don't necessarily need to do a course in data processing or project management or any of those things. You're talking about kind of just more global personal development in a number of different ways, as you've just described. So there's a question that always comes up on blogs, and you've probably seen it, as to whether lawyers need to learn to code. What do you think about that? I'm interested.
Well, I think that the claim that all lawyers need to learn to code is ridiculous. It's pure rubbish. Now ask me what I really think. I say that because, it's sort of like technology. One can be a technology expert and be wholly unable, as I am, for example. I couldn't drop my computer on the floor and put it back together in 20 minutes. That's why I feel God made teenagers. Yep. Okay, but I think there's a difference between, understanding how technology can be applied and being a technologist yourself. And in that sense, I think it's the same thing with data. It's the same thing with coding. It's any of these things. I think you have to understand, how coding fits into the process. Now, if you are one of those people who has a STEM background, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, you probably do have an aptitude for coding, and it may very well be one of those differentiators that sets you apart from the pack, to be both a coder and a licensed attorney. To that person, I would say, go for it. That's great. But I think that for most people, it's not necessary to be an expert in that any more than it is necessary, for example, to be a data analyst. However, I think the important point that I would want to make is, for those of you out there, it's really important to consider that not everybody within the field has to come with the same skill sets. Each of us is our own type of person. We come from different backgrounds, we have different attitudes, and I would say, whereas the legal industry, when I was coming up, wanted to make everybody cut from the same bolt of cloth. Today, I think it's much more of, dare I say, a mosaic. It's a legal mosaic that embrace what makes you, embrace your differences, but do understand that if you want to play the legal game, you have to not only understand, sort of the basics of legal principles, but you also have to have so-called augmented skills. Where you put your chips, however, on those augmented skills might differ from person to person.
Okay, so what you're saying is that having a broad range, having a broad skill set is definitely a plus point for being a lawyer of the future. So rather than focusing kind of all your energy on just learning the black letter law, it's good to spread your skill set and learn a number of different skills which are potentially going to help you in the future. So,
I would just, if I may interrupt and say, it's not just good, it's necessary. Because fewer and fewer lawyers going forward are going to have traditional practice careers. That is to say, to do those kinds of differentiated tasks like going before tribunals, what you do, or maybe being the person who is going to actually sit across from another side and do the final bits of a merger or an acquisition. So whether it's litigation or transactional work, criminal work, it doesn't matter. That is increasingly shrinking, and what is expanding are the different ways that those core skills are being leveraged so that they can be applied to the customer or client more efficiently and more cost effectively.
So you are still effectively a specialist in your field of law. You just have a wider skill set. You're not solely focused on the black letter law and providing that service to the client. You're more innovative effectively. You look at the whole picture of client service delivery rather than just your micro role as giving them legal advice.
Exactly. That's a very good encapsulation. And I would say that in a kind of an interesting way, at least interesting to me, we've kind of gone full circle and we're back to the future. When I was a young lawyer, before the age of mega firms, even younger lawyers tended to have direct client contact to some significant degree. Today, so many lawyers, particularly those who work at larger corporate firms or even larger firms like yours, who are in the so-called retail space, where they're dealing more with individuals or small and mid-sized enterprises. There is today many layers removed between younger lawyers and the actual clients. And so those lawyers are denied several opportunities. First, they are denied the opportunity to interact directly with the client. They are denied the opportunity to acquire client skills. Managing clients, I think, are essential to any professional. And also, I think that they increasingly, don't understand that clients are looking for solutions to problems. They are not looking for legal briefs. They are not looking for 1,000 what ifs. And I think that lawyers have to do a better job of understanding that they are not in the legal business, they are in the problem-solving business, of which legal issues are just one of many challenges.
Yeah. Okay, so what impact does this have on legal business or law firm business models? Because historically, the traditional law firm model has been a partnership model, which is kind of like a pyramid structure, isn't it? And it's based largely on billable hours as well. So actually your focus as a lawyer has been on getting those hours on the clock. That is your primary focus. So now that we've got all of these other skills and other ideas, things that are bringing to the table, does that mean that that model has to change? Is that model still sustainable when thinking about all these other different skills that we're now bringing to the table?
Well, that's a great question. And so if one were to look at the astronomical amounts of money that many lawyers still make, so-called profit per partner, they make large amounts of money, and even younger associates at larger firms make large amounts of money. But I would say that, and it's not just me saying it, but it's the data that is suggesting that that traditional model is very quickly, I think, eroding. And whereas as recently as 5 years ago, that traditional model was by far and away the predominant, almost the exclusive delivery model in the legal industry. Yeah. Today, it is by no means has a monopoly. And so if you're interested in the sort of trajectory of the industry, there are many different sources that you could read, whether they're opinion pieces, but let's stick to the data-driven pieces. There is something called the Georgetown Report on the state of the legal service industry. And it's an annual report that is put out by a large conglomerate called Thomson Reuters. Yeah. And Georgetown Law School, where I used to be a distinguished professor. And it's a study of the industry and its trends. And what they have finally concluded is what I've been writing about for about 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years, that the pyramidal model, as you described, the traditional partnership model, is actually in its sunset. And it is increasingly being challenged, not by lawyers, but by clients who are saying, this may work very well for a few partners, but it's increasingly not working terribly well for us. And by the way, it's not just cost, the prohibitive cost, but it's also they realize that there are different kinds of skill sets that are necessary to deliver legal services in a form and fashion that they are looking for them to be delivered in. So I think that it is a marketplace of change, and therefore the word of advice that I would give prospective lawyers and young lawyers is don't presuppose that the traditional law firm model is going to predominate too much longer, and don't presuppose that if you continue to work diligently in that model, one day you too will reap the considerable rewards that your elders have, because I don't think that's a terribly good bet in most cases.
Okay, very interesting and very insightful. At present, what's your assessment of how many law firms are actually in practice moving away from that model? And because my experience is that I agree with you, but I still think that a lot of firms are sticking with that model, and I don't think it's quite resonated yet. I mean, do you think the billable hour will die out completely at some point, or is it still applicable, or is it still relevant to some areas of law and some types of clients and not so much others? Will there just be more of a different spread of how law firms are charging and how they're structured?
So let me answer your question 2 ways. First, directly, in terms of, and I think you've kind of touched on a very interesting issue, which is, well, Mark, if the changes that you're speaking about, hopefully somewhat forcefully, if not persuasively, are in fact taking place, why is it and how is it that more law firms aren't responding? And the answer is because I think that it's really, again, something that is intrinsic to their structure. And that is the people in law firms who are dictating the perpetuation of the model are generally older white men. Yeah. And they are generally people who are within hailing distance of retiring from the firm. They have no long-term equity interest in the firm. They have to split up profits every year. And so they are left with the decision in terms of making investments in the future, whether it's investments in upskilling their workforce, or whether it's investments in technology or anything else. I think that they're saying, why should I make that investment when it's coming directly out of my pocket and I'm going to be retired in a couple of years? So I think that there is a compelling economic and structural reason why law firms are not making the change. Now, on the other hand, that change is being made by other new types of delivery models. So for example, the big four professional service companies are very much have a different model with different skill sets, different price points, different delivery capability, And might I say that already they are generating more gross revenue from legal service delivery than the largest law firms. And they are employing as many lawyers as the largest Magic Circle firms. So that change is already happening, and it's again not being driven by lawyers, but it's being driven by clients who are changing their buying habits and increasingly saying, for example, we don't need to go to a law firm for this, or we don't necessarily want the billable hour model. We would prefer fixed pricing or some form or fashion of it. So I think you've got this dichotomy between that portion of the marketplace that is, sort of being driven or directed by lawyers, and that portion that is being market driven by clients.
Okay, definitely. And this is really interesting in light of what's going on with the SQE as well. I'm not sure if you know.
I know quite well.
Yes, so this is very interesting that it's kind of throwing up all these different business models are turning up in the marketplace, plus there's now new ways for you guys of getting into the law, which could involve going down that route. So it kind of works in synergy, really, doesn't it? I think with the way that legal education is changing, the way you're qualifying is changing against the way the market is changing. So I think that's a really interesting point you made about the Big Four coming through. So if you were building a legal business of the future, what would it look like? What kind of model would you have? What people would you have working your business? Would it be an ABS? What would it look like?
Well, it's funny that you should ask that question because I built several legal businesses. So let me tell you a little bit about a business model that I created 12 years ago, a company called Clearspire. And for anyone who might be interested in learning more about it, you can actually go and read a short monograph I wrote on it called The Clearspire Story. And it's accessible on my website, www.legalmosaic.com, and click on the Clearspire story. Basically what we did, and this is 12 years ago when the marketplace was quite different, is we separated out the practice of law from the delivery of legal services. That is to say, we had a law firm, but our law firm operated strictly on a fixed fee basis. And we had a service company which was able to deliver legal services in a very different way that was much more tech-enabled, process-driven. We didn't have traditional office spaces. We were able to work largely remotely around the globe, and it was very, very successful. We hired not only lawyers, but we also hired technologists, we hired data analysts, we hired sociologists to counsel us in terms of how is it that people who are working on a largely remote basis could feel like they are part of an integrated team when they are practicing in geographically disparate markets, etc. I think that a lot of those principles, Christie, are still very much applicable today. And in fact, our Clearspire model is being replicated by any number of companies in different ways. A couple of examples would be a enterprise legal service company called United Lex. Another company would be Elevate. Another company would be Atrium that just raised another $65 million and are very gracious in saying that Clearspire was its inspiration and the basis of its model. So I think at the risk of sounding somewhat self-congratulatory,
you're allowed, it's okay.
I think that what I would do is I would hire fewer lawyers in the traditional practice sense, and I would hire many, many more people who knew enough about the legal marketplace to be dangerous, but who were experts in the delivery of legal services. And I'll just give one other little kind of piece of anecdotal information that I think is quite interesting. I do a lot of work in Singapore with the Singapore government. They are really revolutionizing their own legal industry, not only in Singapore, but throughout all of Asia and beyond. I had an opportunity to moderate a panel with some of their largest companies. And the General Counsel of the largest bank there, I asked him, how would you characterize your in-house legal team? And he said, well, we are really a technology company that is in the legal service business. And I said, how many people are in your department? He said 500. And I said, how many of them are licensed attorneys and how many of them are allied legal professionals? Only 10%, 50 people were licensed attorneys. The other 450 in his legal department were not licensed attorneys. That should tell you a little bit about where the direction of the market is moving.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And one more question for you before we wrap up. If you were starting again, you were a student coming into the legal marketplace at this stage, or what advice would you give effectively to a student coming into this marketplace? What would your 3 top tips be for considering your legal future at this stage?
Great question. It's kind of hard to limit them to 3, but I'll try.
Okay, I'll allow you a couple more if you want.
Okay, so I think the first thing that I would do is I would do due diligence. I would really take a little time and read up on the legal industry and make absolutely certain that this is what the legal industry is today, as opposed to what a friend or someone's parent or uncle who's a lawyer might tell you it is, and say, is this the kind of industry that I really want to go into? Because it's very, very different. I think it offers many more possibilities than it once did, but it also presents certain challenges. And by the way, if I were responding to the same question to people in the United States, I would say, take a long, hard look at the economics of it.
Yeah.
Because the average law student in the United States ends up graduating from law school with a aggregate debt between their university and law school of typically almost 150,000 pounds. So economics would be one. Fortunately, in the UK, I don't think it's as big a factor. But so point 1, study about the industry and make sure it's something you want. Number 2, learn your craft. That is, understand, learn the basics of law, but also get experience. I'm a great believer in experiential learning. I did it myself, over 4 decades ago, and it served me very well. And also recognize that you don't have to fit into a single bolt of cloth. You are who you are, and as I would tell my own daughters, look at your unique personality and your skill sets and see how you can meld them creatively and thoughtfully with your legal training in such a way that you are your own brand, and you have to treat yourself that way. And Chrissie, I think you of all people personify that. You are very good at creating an individual brand. That is something that I think everybody should strive to do. And then the third thing that I would say is, and I think I mentioned it before, recognize that once you qualify, that is the start of your learning. That is not the end of your learning.
Yes.
And that you should adopt a learning for life mentality, and you should always strive to be keeping up with, and maybe some of you to be a little ahead of the curve in the marketplace. Because I really believe that the future is very, very bright for those people who are going to be, sort of taking that kind of approach.
Yeah, well, I would agree with all of those things, all really useful information, and you regularly give exceptional pearls of wisdom in your columns on Forbes, so I will link all of those details below with a load of articles which I think are brilliant by you.
Thank you.
And yes, also all your social media details, because you often tweet and post on LinkedIn, and you're also headlining. You're in the headlining slot of Legal Geek, which is awesome. So I'll try and get a little bit of that on video as well. But thank you so much for taking time out of your very busy day
Pleasure.
to come and speak to LAB, and hopefully have you back again another time.
I'd love to.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
Thank you, Chrissie.
Bye.
Bye.